a test for the US. While there is a lot of news about the coronavirus, there is still a lack of understanding about the severity of the threat. President Trump keeps sending mixed messages on the outbreak in the US, going out of his way to deny evidence and brush aside the threat.
You may ask about the coronavirus, which is very well under control in our country.
Coronavirus cases have been reported in several US states, including Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Texas, Utah, Wisconsin, and Washington. When Trump speaks on the issue, he seeks not to inform, but to manipulate. He has contradicted his own health officials and blamed his political opponents for the spread of the virus.
Whether it's the virus that we're talking about or many other public health threats, the Democrat policy of open borders is a direct threat to the health and well-being of all Americans. Now, you see it with the coronavirus. You see it.
Administration officials, public health experts, and lawmakers say the White House's response has been defined by confusion, misinformation, and bureaucratic infighting. Trump has downplayed the threat, saying the disease is going to disappear one day like a miracle.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
Is President Trump failing the leadership test on this?
I think there's little question that President Trump is failing to provide appropriate leadership with respect to the coronavirus. The situation admittedly came about very quickly and has accelerated following the lines of the exponential function. But the almost complete dismantling of public health services in the federal government under the Trump administration certainly has left the country in a vulnerable position. So I think it's fair to say that President Trump has failed the leadership test on this particular issue.
Trump claimed concern about the virus was the new hoax by Democrats after the Russia investigation and his impeachment.
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. They're politicizing it. We did one of the great jobs. You say, how's President Trump doing? They go, oh, not good, not good. They have no clue. They don't have any clue. They can't even count their votes in Iowa. They can't even count.
Trump has accused the media of making the coronavirus look as bad as possible, including panicking markets if possible. The stock market has plunged in response to the global outbreak, and Trump is clearly rattled.
Today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 1,192 points in one day. That's the largest single-day point drop in the Dow ever. The Dow has now dropped 3,200 points this week. The S&P, the NASDAQ, and the Dow all had their largest one-day point declines ever today.
In his tweets and public statements, Trump keeps talking about the stock market as if he's more worried about the state of the economy than the public health.
I really think the stock market is something I know a lot about. I think it took a hit maybe for two reasons. I think they look at the people that you watched debating last night and they say if there's even a possibility that can happen. I think it really takes a hit because of that. And it certainly took a hit because of this. And I understand that also because of supply chains and various other things and people coming in.
Trump knows that his chances of getting re-elected in November depend on his stewardship of the economy. President Trump is reportedly trying to stop U.S. health officials from talking about the spread of the coronavirus over fears that it will impact the stock market and hurt his re-election prospects. The New York Times reported that public communications about the virus from scientists will need clearance from the White House.
Anything that could be done wrong probably has been done wrong. That starts with the president himself continuing to make inaccurate statements about the consequences of the policies adopted, inaccurate statements about the pace of vaccine development, about the likely spread of the disease in the United States. And you couple that with the announcement today, the implementation today of a decision to silence our senior public health officials.
Trump and his Republican allies in Congress have rejected all safety nets, including paid sick leave that people need to deal with personal health emergencies. Has the Trump administration made the U.S. more vulnerable to health crises?
The White House definitely has made the United States more vulnerable to public health crises, including the coronavirus, by defunding, in some cases, to a tremendous degree, organizations within the executive branch, such as the Department of Health and Human Services, such as Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. These are important organizations that are charged with helping maintain public health.
Lawmakers have condemned the $2.5 billion the White House has requested from Congress to tackle the coronavirus, arguing that it was too small to make any difference.
We are not prepared for this or for anything like it in the future, especially with the budget that came out that cut CDC, that cut NIH, where we're seeing firsthand right now why it's so important that we're prepared.
Congress later approved an emergency funding of $8.3 billion. Trump has also proposed a $3 billion cut to global health programs, which would see the World Health Organization's budget slashed by more than half. In addition, experts chide the Trump administration for ignoring the climate change, a phenomenon that could potentially accelerate the emergence of new viruses.
What is more important in this case, and that is being almost completely ignored by the governments and the media throughout the world, is the threat posed by abrupt climate change. Abrupt climate change is melting glaciers and exposing viruses that we have not seen for thousands of years, in some cases hundreds of thousands of years. And those viruses, in addition to the coronavirus, present a tremendous existential threat to our species.
As the death toll from the coronavirus continues to rise in the United States, the shortcomings of the nation's healthcare system have experts worried. About a fifth of Americans either have poor health insurance or no insurance at all. For them, there is no feasible way to get the care they need if they start developing symptoms. Millions of American workers simply cannot afford to stay home. In some states, they don't have the legal right to do so without losing their jobs or pay.
You mentioned that about a fifth of Americans don't have access to health care. I'm one of those people. I have no health care, no insurance whatsoever. And I'm in a position of relative privilege compared to most people in the United States and most people in the world. But we've been on this track for a long time of not taking seriously public health and health care for individuals. So it's no surprise that we ended up in a situation that the entire government is not prepared for the disasters that are now coming our way.
U.S. health officials still seem to be prioritizing the profits of the healthcare industry over the public's health. The Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar has ruled out implementing price controls on a coronavirus vaccine. Why is the U.S. government unwilling to implement price control?
The United States government is now, and always has been, more interested in corporate profits than in public health or public safety. So this is an overt example. It couldn't be more obvious in this case, but it's been pretty apparent to people paying attention for a very long time. It's obvious, and it's been obvious since the early 1980s when the United States privatized the prison system. When you privatize the prison system, what does that do? It makes the system be more concerned about profits than about justice.
Americans, especially the 27 million who don't have health insurance, are known to avoid medical help because of the expensive cost. A study by the University of Chicago has shown that every year about 40% of Americans skip medical tests or treatment when they are sick. Experts say this is a uniquely American problem in the developed world. platform for bigotry. Every year, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, known as AIPAC, which is the largest official Israeli lobby in the United States, hosts a huge conference in Washington. The event draws nearly 20,000 people who listen to the speakers, many of whom are Washington's most powerful politicians.
President Trump promised the United States would ensure that Israel would always have the resources and tools she needed to defend herself by herself. And today, I'm proud to report that American support for the security of the State of Israel is greater than ever before, and the State of Israel is stronger than ever before in its history.
This year's event took place a little over a month after President Trump unveiled his controversial and one-sided plan for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It also came during a busy campaign period for U.S. presidential candidates. What does the annual AIPAC conference achieve? Who are the main beneficiaries?
Well, I think when we talk about beneficiaries in terms of people who attend these AIPAC conferences, you simply have to follow the trail of the money. It's not simply AIPAC or AIPAC that provides a lot of money for candidates, but it's also a window of cover for people running in different districts around the country and people running in senatorial races and in presidential races.
AIPAC is a leading organization within the Israeli lobby that promotes Israeli interests in the United States. Critics say AIPAC has a stranglehold on the US Congress. It deploys money and influence to ensure Israel gets very special treatment from Washington. The group heavily lobbies lawmakers for continued support for Israel, including billions of dollars in annual aid to the regime.
What AIPAC does is they demand unconditional U.S. diplomatic and financial support for Israel. That includes even supporting Israel's illegal settlement enterprise. And they demand continuing increases in military aid to Israel, already at $3.8 billion a year. I don't want the crimes of occupation and apartheid to be committed in my name or my children's name as a Jewish woman.
AIPAC has been accused of influencing members of Congress through campaign donations. The lobby group is also very active in smearing those who defend Palestinian rights. After being criticized by Senator Bernie Sanders, AIPAC funded attack ads against the Democratic frontrunner in several battleground states. Why does the Israel lobby hold such a powerful sway over Washington?
It's not just AIPAC. There are believed to be at least 30 of these organizations in the country that are not simply represented in regard to financing politicians' runs for election and re-election, but a lot of these think tanks in Washington, D.C., right and left, who advertise themselves with very innocuous names, in so many instances turn out to have a very pro-Zionist orientation. So if you've got that kind of a political power structure in place with plenty of money behind it, as the Israeli lobby certainly does, that's why they've had the absolute monolithic control that they have had of American policy in both of the major.
There was a time when U.S. presidential candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, would jump at the chance to address AIPAC's policy conference, trying to outdo each other in their fanatic support for Israel. But this year's conference was remarkably different. Several Democratic candidates skipped the event, reflecting how polarized support for Israel has become. Sanders outright boycotted the conference after denouncing AIPAC as a platform for bigotry. Sanders, who would be America's first Jewish president if elected, also called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a reactionary racist.
I am very proud of being Jewish. I actually lived in Israel for some months. But what I happen to believe is that right now, sadly, tragically, in Israel, through Bibi Netanyahu, you have a reactionary racist who is now running that country. And I happen to believe that what our foreign policy in the Mideast should be about is absolutely protecting the independence and security of Israel. but you cannot ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people.
At the conference, Netanyahu derided the Palestinians to the cheers of the audience. He also pledged to annex more parts of the occupied West Bank, a move that would make the two-state solution all but impossible. Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the UN, also denounced Sanders as a liar and ignorant fool. Vice President Mike Pence gave a naked partisan speech, attacking Sanders for criticizing Israel.
Those who side with Israel's enemies must never be allowed to call themselves friends of Israel. It is wrong to boycott and slander Israel. It is wrong to boycott and slander AIPAC.
Has AIPAC become a platform for bigotry and a platform against anyone who dares to criticize Israel? Did the conference prove Sanders right?
I think it proves Senator Sanders entirely correct. This AIPAC conference is filled with people who basically believe that Israel not only has a right to all of what they currently possess in Palestine, but that Israel has a right to take whatever else they want, all the way from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, all the way to the Nile. This is what the statement Greater Israel is all about, which is found in so many of the party platforms if you look closely at what the different political parties in Israel represent.
Sanders was not the only Democratic presidential candidate who boycotted the AIPAC conference. Most others skipped the event as well, with some sending video messages addressing the attendees. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren also ruled out speaking at the conference.
For America to be a good ally of Israel and of the Palestinians, we need to encourage both parties to get to the negotiating table. And we're not doing that if we keep standing with one party and saying, we're on your side. We're going to give you all the things you asked for all kinds of political reasons domestically here and domestically in Israel.
Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who later dropped out of the race, and Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar did not attend the pro-Israel event either. The 2020 campaign was the first time top contenders boycotted the massive policy conference. That does not mean that the Democratic establishment has turned against AIPAC. The boycott movement could reflect how caucus and primary voters are choosing their candidates. What is the significance of the AIPAC boycott movement?
I think it's a situation where politicians are beginning to recognize that being absolutely fanatically pro-Israel is not the positive selling point with the American public that it once was. This gets back to everything that's been going on since 2001, the amount of money that the United States has spent in these wars, the number of Americans who have been killed, the number of Americans who have been wounded and who suffer from things like post-traumatic stress syndrome, with the meter still running. The average American is beginning to figure out that in terms of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and now there's talk of going to war with Iran, that these are policies that have not benefited the people of this country.
The boycott of Israel and AIPAC is a byproduct of a new generation of Americans, including young Jews who reject right-wing nationalism, militarism, and the entire system of money in politics. It is the result of the Israeli regime's continued expansion of settlements on occupied territories and total disregard for the basic human rights of the Palestinians. Through a video message, Joe Biden acknowledged this fact at the AIPAC conference, saying Israel's policies are undermining support for Israel among young Americans.
I have a sense that support of the Zionist state, the sort of thing that we have seen politically in the United States since the late 1940s, that is somewhat on the wane with younger American voters. With young Jews, presume that it might be because they recognize that when there is a backlash, and there will be a backlash against the American foreign policy that has committed the United States to wars and bloodshed, largely on Israel's behalf, as that becomes increasingly unpopular in the United States over time, as more people begin to link that in their own minds to support for Israel.
The increased alignment between the Republican Party and the Israeli regime might also be a factor in alienating many Jewish Americans.
You have been the greatest friend that Israel has ever had in the White House.
Americans, especially the younger generation, have grown tired of racism, fanaticism, and bigotry promoted by both Trump and Netanyahu. Is support for Israel waning among young Americans?
If in fact he is elected as the president of the United States, we have to understand just how powerful the Israeli lobby is, that very few people want to go up against it. The Republican Party is obviously overwhelmingly in the camp of the most radical Zionist elements that exist. In the Democratic Party, the older establishment wing of the Democratic Party is solidly pro-Zionist. And then, of course, these younger progressives who are backing people like Bernie Sanders are beginning to have pause for concern.
Trump's so-called deal of the century was a huge gift to Israel. It would allow Israel to annex all its West Bank settlements, as well as the Jordan Valley, while recognizing Jerusalem al-Quds as the undivided capital of Israel. The plan would eliminate the Palestinian refugees' right of return and give Israel security control of any potential Palestinian state.
Under this vision, Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided, very important, undivided capital.
A Gallup poll last year showed that 65% of American Jews identify as Democrats or lean Democratic. President Trump has polarized the debate on Israel, making establishment Democrats like Joe Biden very uncomfortable, while allowing progressives like Bernie Sanders to openly criticize Israel. Will Trump's unconditional support for Israel eventually backfire?
I think it will ultimately backfire on the entire country. Why? Because as I've already said, these policies are so extreme. Trump has simply committed us to more of this, which not only endangers the entire country, but there is in the Republican Party an irreconcilable ideological conflict that has not yet been made apparent to millions of people who voted for Donald Trump. You can't say that you're America first. You can't say that you want to get out of foreign wars. You can't say that you want to spend more time with domestic problems, pressing domestic problems in this country, and turn around and do what Trump is doing with this deal of the century, where obviously it is handing Israel everything that it wants.